My husband's pregnant assistant showed up at family dinner, then I revealed the prenup clause. My name is Cheryl, 58 years old, and a corporate attorney at Wilson & Partners in Boston. For 32 years, I've been married to Richard, supporting his business growth while building my own career. I've always prided myself on being vigilant and prepared both professionally and personally. Last month, during what should have been a celebratory dinner party, my world nearly collapsed. But my legal background saved both my marriage and my dignity. If you enjoy stories about women who outsmart manipulative situations, let me know where you're watching from and subscribe to my channel. I met Richard during our second year of law school. He was charming, ambitious, and had this infectious laugh that would echo through the university library, earning him stern looks from other students. I found it endearing. While I was methodical and careful, he was spontaneous and bold. We balanced each other perfectly, or so I believed. After graduation, we married in a small ceremony with just close family and friends. My career took off immediately at Wilson & Partners, where I specialized in corporate law. The stability of my job provided us with financial security, while Richard pursued his dream of starting his own financial consulting firm. The early years weren't easy. We lived in a modest apartment, carefully budgeting every dollar. I would work late nights preparing cases, while Richard networked tirelessly, building his client base. We were a team supporting each other's ambitions without hesitation. When his business began showing promise, I made the decision to put my career advancement on partial hold. I declined the opportunity to become a partner to focus on supporting Richard's growing business. I would review his contracts, offer legal advice, and even helped set up his corporate structure. My colleagues thought I was making a mistake, but I believed in us as a unit. His success would be mine too. Over the years, Richard's business flourished. From a one-man operation working out of our spare bedroom, he built Monroe Financial Consulting into a respected firm with over 50 employees. Meanwhile, we were blessed with two wonderful children. Amanda, now 30, followed my footsteps into medicine and became a successful pediatrician. Jason, 28, inherited his father's entrepreneurial spirit and founded a promising tech startup. As our finances improved, we moved into a beautiful Victorian home in Brookline, an upscale Boston suburb. 4 bedrooms, a sun-filled kitchen, where I loved to cook Sunday brunches for the family, and a garden that became my sanctuary. The house reflected our success and the life we had built together. Before we married, I insisted on a prenuptial agreement. This wasn't a romantic gesture, but my father was a divorce attorney who had seen too many nasty endings to beautiful beginnings. Love with your heart, Cheryl, he told me, but protect yourself with your head. Richard was initially hurt by my suggestion, but eventually understood. My father was particularly insistent about certain clauses being included. At the time, I thought he was being overly cautious, but I trusted his judgment. The prenup was filed away in our safe, hopefully never to be needed. For 30 years, it wasn't. Over the past year, Richard's behavior began to change subtly. The late nights at the office became more frequent. Weekend emergency meetings with clients started appearing on his calendar. He purchased a new wardrobe, more expensive and youthful than his usual conservative suits. He joined a new gym and became obsessive about his appearance in a way that seemed uncharacteristic for a man approaching 60. At first, I dismissed these changes as a midlife crisis or work stress. His company had been expanding into new markets, which naturally demanded more of his time. Whenever I expressed concern about his long hours, he would reassure me with a quick kiss and a promise to make it up to me. But other signs were harder to ignore. His phone became an extension of his hand, and he would turn away when texting. His laptop password changed, and he began taking calls in another room. The emotional distance between us grew wider, despite my attempts to reconnect. Date nights became rarer, and when we did go out, Richard seemed distracted, his mind elsewhere. Our conversations, once flowing easily about everything from politics to our children's achievements, became superficial. He stopped asking about my cases or sharing details about his clients. The partnership that had defined our marriage for 3 decades was eroding, and I couldn't pinpoint exactly when the shift had begun. I tried talking to him directly about the changes I was noticing, but he would become defensive, accusing me of being paranoid or controlling. "You're just insecure because you're getting older," he said, during one particularly painful argument. The comment stung, not just because of its cruelty, but because there was a kernel of truth to my insecurities about aging. I was approaching 60, dealing with all the physical changes that entails, while Richard seemed determined to recapture his youth. Still, I held on to hope that this was just a phase. Marriages have ebbs and flows, I told myself. We had built too much together to throw it all away. If I could just be patient, understanding, and loving, surely we would find our way back to each other. I was wrong. The first time I heard Megan Walker's name was during a casual dinner conversation about 10 months ago. Richard mentioned he had hired a new executive assistant with exceptional organizational skills and fresh perspectives. He spoke with unusual animation about how she had already streamlined several office procedures. She graduated top of her class from Wharton, he boasted, as if her credentials somehow reflected on him. "We're lucky to have snagged her before the big investment firms did." I thought nothing of it initially. Richard had gone through several assistants over the years, and he was always appreciative of competence. It wasn't until the company Christmas party, 2 months later, that I actually met Megan. The annual holiday gathering was held at the Langham, a luxury hotel in downtown Boston. I wore a red dress I had saved for special occasions, feeling confident and looking forward to an evening with Richard's colleagues, many of whom had become friends over the years. Richard and I arrived separately, as I had a late client meeting. When I entered the ballroom, my eyes automatically searched for him in the crowd. I found him near the bar, engaged in animated conversation with a young woman I didn't recognize. She was laughing at something he said, her hand resting casually on his arm. She was strikingly beautiful in an obvious way, tall and slender, with shoulder-length blonde hair, and wearing a black dress that seemed more appropriate for a nightclub than a corporate event. As I approached, I noticed her perfectly manicured nails, the expensive designer shoes, and the way she leaned in, slightly too close, when speaking to Richard. "Ah, Cheryl, there you are," Richard said as I approached a fraction too enthusiastically. "This is Megan Walker, my new executive assistant. Megan, this is my wife, Cheryl." "Mrs. Monroe, I've heard so much about you," Megan said, extending her hand. Her grip was firm, professional, but her smile didn't quite reach her eyes as they assessed me from head to toe. "Richard speaks of you constantly." "Please call me Cheryl," I replied automatically, though something in me rebelled against the familiarity. "Richard mentioned you've been making quite an impression at the office." "I try my best," she said with practiced modesty. "Your husband is an amazing mentor. I feel so lucky to be learning from someone with his experience and vision." Throughout the evening, I noticed how Megan seemed to orbit around Richard. She would fetch him drinks, laugh enthusiastically at his jokes, and somehow manage to insert herself into every conversation he had. When we were momentarily alone, I mentioned her attentiveness to him. "She's just eager to network," he dismissed. "First big corporate job, wants to make connections. You know how it is when you're starting out." But what unsettled me most was the way they looked at each other. There was an intensity in their eye contact that felt inappropriate, a silent communication that excluded everyone else. I had seen enough workplace affairs during my legal career to recognize the signs, but I pushed the thought away. Richard wouldn't do that to me, to our family, after 30 years together. Would he? Over the next few months, Megan's name began appearing in our conversations with increasing frequency. "Megan found this great new restaurant we should try," or "Megan suggested this investment opportunity that looks promising." She was no longer just his assistant. She had somehow become a trusted advisor whose opinions influenced his decisions. When I expressed my discomfort with her seemingly expanding role, Richard accused me of professional jealousy. "She's young and has fresh ideas," he snapped. "Just because she didn't have to fight her way up like you did doesn't make her insights less valuable." My suspicions grew when I unexpectedly stopped by Richard's office to suggest lunch together, something we hadn't done in months. His secretary, an older woman who had been with the company for years, informed me he was already at lunch. Through the glass doors of the building, I spotted Richard and Megan walking toward a small French bistro down the street. There was nothing overtly inappropriate about colleagues having lunch, but the way he placed his hand on the small of her back as they entered the restaurant sent a chill through me. At a legal conference, I ran into Patricia Coleman, whose husband served on Richard's board of directors. After a few glasses of wine, she asked with careful casualness, "So, how are you handling Richard's new protégé, Megan? She seems very capable," I replied, maintaining my composure while my stomach twisted. Patricia gave me a look of mingled pity and embarrassment. "Cheryl, I'm sorry, but people are talking. Thomas mentioned they seem unusually close at board meetings. She attends all of them, now apparently taking extensive notes right next to Richard." Similar hints came from other friends in our social circle. Gentle inquiries about whether everything was okay at home. Comments about how energized Richard seemed lately. Each remark was a small cut, painful, but not fatal on its own. My self-confidence began to erode. I found myself scrutinizing my appearance in mirrors, noting every line and sign of aging. I started researching cosmetic procedures, considering clothes that were more youthful. Then I caught myself and felt a surge of anger. I had built a successful career, raised 2 incredible children, and supported my husband's dreams. Why was I the one feeling inadequate? Meanwhile, Richard's criticisms of me became more frequent. My cooking, once praised, was now too heavy or traditional. My classic wardrobe was suddenly matronly. Even my opinions, which he had valued for decades, were dismissed as outdated. I considered hiring a private investigator, but decided against it. What would I do with proof? Did I really want to know? Part of me clung to the possibility that I was misreading everything, that this was all a terrible coincidence of midlife crisis and a young assistant who admired her boss too much. But in my heart, I knew something was very wrong. As our 32nd wedding anniversary approached, I decided to host a dinner party at our home. We had always celebrated our anniversaries, even during the leanest years, and I wasn't about to break tradition, despite the growing tension between us. I invited our closest family and friends, people who had been witnesses to our journey together. I threw myself into the planning, perhaps hoping that the effort would remind Richard of what we had built together. I designed a menu featuring dishes from significant moments in our relationship: the lobster bisque from the restaurant where he proposed the roast beef he loved from our first apartment dinner party, the chocolate soufflé from our 20th anniversary trip to Paris. The day before the dinner, while finalizing the place settings at our dining table, Richard casually mentioned, "By the way, I invited Megan to join us tomorrow night." I looked up, certain I had misheard. To our anniversary dinner. She helped arrange some of the gifts and reservations for the weekend getaway I planned for us, he explained, not meeting my eyes. It seemed rude not to include her, since she put in the effort. "Richard, this is a celebration of our marriage with our closest friends and family," I said, struggling to keep my voice steady. "Having your assistant there is inappropriate." "You're being unreasonable," he replied, his tone dismissive. "She's an important part of the company now. Besides, everyone already knows her." "Not in this context," I argued. "Not as a guest in our home, celebrating our personal milestone." "It's already done," he said firmly. "She's expecting to come, and I won't uninvite her. It would be unprofessional." I called Sandra, my best friend, since college, immediately after. "He's bringing her to our anniversary dinner," I said, my voice breaking. "In our home." "Cheryl," Sandra said carefully, "I think you need to prepare yourself for what might happen. This doesn't sound like just a workplace friendship anymore. What should I do? Cancel the whole thing?" "No," she advised. "That's exactly what he might want an excuse to paint you as emotional and difficult. Stay calm, be vigilant, and remember who you are. You're Cheryl Monroe, the woman who graduated top of her class and became one of Boston's most respected corporate attorneys while raising 2 amazing kids. Whatever happens, you'll handle it with dignity." After hanging up, I sat in my home office, surrounded by law books and family photographs. Sandra was right. Something in my gut told me tomorrow would bring things to a head. Richard's insistence on including Megan felt like more than just poor judgment. It felt like a statement. I opened our safe and took out the prenuptial agreement we had signed all those years ago. I hadn't looked at it in decades, but my father's voice echoed in my mind. "Make sure you understand every word in this document, Cheryl. It may seem excessive now, but you'll thank me someday." As I read through the legal language, I found the clause my father had specifically insisted upon. It was unusual, far more specific than standard infidelity provisions. At the time, I had been embarrassed by his insistence on its inclusion. But now, the next morning, I made a discreet call to Harold Jenkins, a colleague at my firm who specialized in divorce law. Just hypothetically, I asked, how would a 30-year-old prenup hold up today, particularly regarding an infidelity clause? If it was properly executed and has been maintained, it could be fully enforceable, Harold replied. Is everything okay, Cheryl? Just reviewing some old cases. I lied. Thanks for the insight. That afternoon, I quietly gathered copies of our financial records, made sure I had access to all joint accounts, and secured important documents. I wasn't planning for divorce. I was preparing for any possibility. My legal training had taught me that being unprepared was the surest path to disaster. As I selected my outfit for the evening, a deep blue dress that had always brought me compliments, I looked at myself in the mirror. The face looking back at me showed lines of experience, wisdom gained through years of challenges overcome. I applied my makeup carefully, not to look younger, but to look like the best version of myself. Whatever happens tonight, I told my reflection, you will not lose your dignity. The evening began beautifully. Our dining room glowed with candlelight, fresh flowers, arranged in the crystal vase that had been my grandmother's, adorned the center of the table. The good china, only used for special occasions, was perfectly arranged alongside polished silver and crystal glasses. The house filled with delicious aromas from the kitchen, where I had spent most of the day preparing our meal. I had chosen my outfit with particular care, a midnight blue dress that complemented my silver hair, which I had stopped coloring years ago. Simple pearl earrings that Richard had given me for our 10th anniversary completed the look. I wanted to feel like myself, not a woman, desperately trying to compete with someone half her age. Our children arrived first. Amanda brought a beautiful arrangement of lilies, my favorite. "The table looks amazing, Mom," she said, hugging me tightly. 32 years is something to celebrate. Jason followed shortly after with a bottle of expensive champagne. "For the strongest woman I know," he said with a wink. His girlfriend Sophia, an architect he'd been dating for 2 years, complimented the house. They didn't know about the tension between Richard and me. I had kept my concerns private, not wanting to damage their relationship with their father. Sandra and her husband Thomas came next, followed by our longtime friends Paul and Diane and Richard's brother Michael with his wife Karen. The atmosphere was warm and festive as everyone mingled in the living room, sharing stories and catching up. Richard was conspicuously late. Just as I was about to call him, I heard the front door open. He entered with Megan beside him, his hand resting lightly on her back in that now familiar gesture that made my stomach clench. She was dressed in a tight red dress that would have been more appropriate for a cocktail party than a family dinner, with heels that brought her to the same height as Richard. "Sorry we're late," Richard announced to the room. Traffic was terrible coming from the office. I noticed he said "we," as if their arrival together was the most natural thing in the world. Our guests' reactions ranged from surprise to discomfort as they registered Megan's presence at our family celebration. Amanda's eyes narrowed slightly as she looked from Megan to her father and then to me with concern. "Welcome," I said, maintaining my composure. "Everyone, this is Megan Richards' assistant. Megan, you know some people here already, I believe." "Thank you for including me in this special celebration," Megan said with practiced charm. "Richard speaks so highly of all of you." As we moved to the dining room, I noticed how Megan maneuvered to sit next to Richard, displacing Karen, who had been about to take that chair. Karen gave me a questioning look, which I answered with a small shake of my head. "Not now." Throughout the appetizer course, Megan dominated the conversation, interrupting others, and somehow managing to turn every topic back to herself or Richard. When Richard and I were working on the Westfield account, or Richard took me to this amazing restaurant for lunch where Richard beamed at her every word as if she were reciting poetry. He barely looked at me, even when I rose to serve the main course that I had spent hours preparing. "Cheryl, this roast is a bit overdone for my taste," Richard commented as I served him. Megan introduced me to this Japanese technique for cooking meat that keeps it much more tender. "I'd be happy to show you sometime," Megan offered with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I'll stick with my mother's recipe, thanks," I replied evenly. It served us well for 30 years. I caught the glances exchanged between our friends. Concern, embarrassment, confusion. Amanda reached under the table and squeezed my hand, briefly in solidarity. My daughter had always been perceptive. As dinner progressed, I noticed the meaningful glances between Richard and Megan becoming more frequent. They had developed that shorthand of inside jokes and references that comes from intimate connection. When she excused herself to use the restroom, Richard's eyes followed her the entire way. "Dad, how's the expansion to the Chicago market going?" Jason asked, clearly, trying to redirect conversation to safer territory. "Actually," Richard brightened, "Megan has been instrumental in developing our strategy there. She did her undergraduate internship in Chicago and has connections that have been invaluable." When time came for the anniversary toasts, Richard's speech felt hollow and rehearsed. He spoke about journeys and growth and new chapters, careful phrases that could mean everything or nothing. He didn't look at me once. During his toast, his eyes fixed somewhere above the heads of our guests. When it was my turn, I spoke with genuine gratitude about our years together, the family we had built, and the memories we shared. I thanked our friends for being part of our journey. If this was to be the end of something, I wanted to honor what had been true and good about it. As I served the chocolate souffle for dessert, I noticed Megan constantly checking her phone, smiling to herself. The tension in the room was palpable now. Everyone sensed something was off, but social convention kept the conversation moving along forced artificial lines. Little did I know that the carefully orchestrated dinner I had planned was about to become a very different kind of milestone in our marriage. As coffee was being served, Megan suddenly stood up, tapping her spoon against her water glass. The delicate crystal rang through the room, bringing conversation to an abrupt halt. All eyes turned to her, standing there in her too-tight red dress, a smile playing at the corners of her lips. "I hope everyone will forgive me for speaking up," she began, her voice carrying a practiced tremor of emotion. "But this night is about celebrating love and family, and I have some wonderful news to share that feels perfect for this special occasion." I felt my body go cold, as if all the blood had suddenly drained from my extremities. Beside me, Sandra reached for my hand under the table, squeezing it in warning or support, perhaps both. Megan placed one manicured hand delicately on her stomach, which I now noticed showed the slightest curve beneath her tight dress. "I'm 3 months pregnant." The silence that followed was absolute. Not a fork clinked, not a breath seemed to be taken. Our guests froze in horrified tableau eyes, darting between Megan, Richard, and me. My children's faces reflected shock and growing comprehension. Richard stood up, pushing back his chair with a scrape that sounded unnaturally loud in the silence. He moved to stand beside Megan, taking her hand in his. The gesture was so deliberate, so public, that its meaning couldn't be mistaken. "I know this comes as a surprise," he said, his voice steady, as if he were handling a difficult client meeting. "Megan and I have grown close over the past months. These things happen. Sometimes we didn't plan it, but we've developed deep feelings for each other." Megan leaned into him, her expression a mixture of triumph and fake humility. She looked directly at me for the first time that evening, her eyes holding a challenge. She expected tears, perhaps a scene, the older wife breaking down at being replaced. The smug smile playing at her lips told me she was enjoying this moment of victory. "I'm going to be a father again," Richard continued, sounding almost proud. "At my age, it's unexpected, but, well, life is full of surprises." Amanda was the first to break the stunned silence. She stood up so quickly, her chair nearly toppled backward. "Are you serious right now? At Mom's anniversary dinner, you're announcing you've been cheating on her with your assistant. Amanda, please understand." Richard started his tone patronizing. "Adult relationships are complicated. Don't you dare speak to me like I'm a child. Amanda cut him off, her voice shaking with anger. I'm a grown woman, watching my father humiliate my mother in her own home at a dinner she spent all day preparing to celebrate 32 years of marriage. Jason stood next to his sister, his face hard with fury. You brought your pregnant mistress to your anniversary dinner. What kind of man does that? Our friends began shifting uncomfortably, murmuring about giving the family privacy. Chairs scraped back as Paul and Diane stood to leave. Please, everyone stay, Richard said, raising his hands. This isn't how we wanted to do this, but now that it's out, let's handle it like adults. We have it all figured out. I finally spoke, my voice surprisingly steady. Yes, Richard nodded, seeming relieved that I was being reasonable. I want to do right by everyone. I'm prepared to offer you a generous settlement, Cheryl. You'll be well taken care of. Megan nodded encouragingly. And we'd be happy to let you stay in the house for 6 months while you find something more suitable for your new circumstances. How considerate, I said, my tone neutral, even as rage and hurt threatened to overwhelm me. The sheer audacity of their performance, clearly rehearsed down to the last detail, was almost impressive in its cruelty. Richard began outlining his proposal. He would keep his business and most of our assets, since they were primarily generated through his work. He spoke about fair division, while essentially suggesting I walk away with a fraction of what we had built together. Throughout his speech, Megan nodded supportively, occasionally adding details like they had discussed this thoroughly. In that moment, watching them stand together in my dining room, planning my financial future, as if I were a burdensome obligation to be managed, something crystallized within me. The hurt was still there, searing and deep, but above it rose a clarity I hadn't felt in months. I was Cheryl Monroe, corporate attorney, mother and woman of substance. I had not spent 30 years building a life to be dismissed with a generous settlement. The room seemed to hold its collective breath, waiting for my breakdown. Instead, they were about to witness something entirely different. I'd like everyone to remain seated for just a moment longer, I said, my voice calm and measured. I have something to add to this presentation. Richard looked momentarily confused by my composure. He had expected tears, recriminations, perhaps pleading. My professional demeanor seemed to unsettle him. Excuse me for a moment, I said, standing and smoothing my dress. I need to retrieve something from my office. As I walked from the dining room, I could hear the uncomfortable murmurs behind me. My heels clicked steadily on the hardwood floors, each step reinforcing my resolve. In my office, I opened the safe, hidden behind a family portrait, and removed a leather portfolio containing the prenuptial agreement that had sat untouched for decades. When I returned to the dining room, a tense silence had fallen. Richard was whispering something to Megan, who looked increasingly agitated. My children sat rigid in their seats, their expressions a mixture of shock and anger. Our friends appeared trapped between social propriety and the desire to flee this uncomfortable scene. I resumed my seat at the head of the table and placed the portfolio in front of me, my hands resting lightly on its leather cover. Since we're discussing settlements and arrangements, I said, adopting the same tone I used in high-stakes negotiations, I think it's important that we have all the facts on the table. I opened the portfolio and removed the prenuptial agreement, its pages still crisp despite the years. As some of you may know, Richard and I signed a comprehensive prenuptial agreement before our marriage. My father was quite insistent on certain provisions. Richard's face began to drain of color as recognition dawned. Cheryl, that old thing can't possibly still be valid. It was 30 years ago. Actually, I replied, prenuptial agreements don't expire, Richard. And my firm has been the custodian of this document, maintaining its legal standing throughout our marriage. That was another of my father's suggestions. I flipped to the page, marked with a tab, and adjusted my reading glasses. I'd like to direct your attention to Clause 17.3, the infidelity provision. It states, and I quote, "In the event that either party engages in extramarital relations resulting in pregnancy with a third party, the unfaithful spouse shall forfeit 75% of all marital assets, including business interests developed during the marriage, to the injured spouse." The room went completely still. Richard's face had turned ashen, while Megan looked from him to me in confusion. "What is she talking about?" Megan hissed at Richard. "You said your wife wouldn't get the company." "She's bluffing," Richard said, but his voice lacked conviction. "That clause can't be enforced." "I consulted with Harold Jenkins yesterday," I continued calmly. "You know Harold, don't you, Richard? One of the top divorce attorneys in Massachusetts. He confirmed the enforceability of this specific clause, particularly given the clear evidence of both infidelity and pregnancy." I turned to Megan, whose triumphant smile had completely vanished. "To be clear, this means that should Richard and I divorce due to his infidelity, with you resulting in your pregnancy, I would be entitled to 75% of all our marital assets. This includes 75% ownership of Monroe Financial Consulting, which was founded and developed during our marriage with substantial support from my legal expertise and my income during its early years." "You can't take my company," Richard said, his voice rising with panic. "Everything we've built," I corrected. "While you were developing client relationships, I was reviewing contracts, establishing the corporate structure, and even defending the company in its first lawsuit, all while raising our children and managing our household. The courts will recognize my contributions." Richard turned to Megan, whose face had transformed from confusion to fury. "You said she was just a housewife," she snapped. "You never mentioned she was a lawyer or that there was some prenup." "I've also taken the precaution," I continued, as if there had been no interruption, "of consulting with the top 5 divorce attorneys in Boston. As of yesterday, they all have conflicts of interest that would prevent them from representing you, Richard." Amanda, despite the tension, couldn't suppress a small smile of pride. Jason looked at me with newfound respect. "You've been planning this," Richard accused, his panic turning to anger. "No, Richard. I've been hoping against hope that my suspicions were wrong. I've been trying to save our marriage, while you've been planning your exit strategy. The only difference is that I was prepared for either outcome." I closed the portfolio and looked directly at Megan. "I think it would be best if you left my home now. Richard, you may want to accompany Ms. Walker to discuss your suddenly complicated future." Megan stood abruptly, grabbing her purse. "This is ridiculous," she spat. "We'll fight this. Tell her, Richard." But Richard seemed unable to respond, the full implications of his actions finally hitting him. His company, his reputation, his financial security, all at risk. "Richard," Megan insisted, tugging at his arm, "tell her we're getting lawyers." "By all means," I replied. "I look forward to meeting them. In the meantime, I'll expect you to remove your personal items from the house tomorrow while I'm at work. I'll have the locks changed in the evening." Megan stormed out, heels clacking furiously across the floor. Richard followed, shooting one last desperate look back at me, a mixture of anger, fear, and perhaps a glimmer of respect. As the front door slammed, the dining room erupted in shocked exclamations and questions. Sandra wrapped her arms around me in a fierce hug. "You magnificent warrior," she whispered in my ear. My children moved to my side, their initial shock giving way to protective concern. "Mom, why didn't you tell us?" Amanda asked. "I didn't want to burden you with suspicions," I replied. And honestly, I kept hoping I was wrong. Paul raised his water glass. "To Cheryl," he said firmly, "the smartest woman in Boston." As glasses were raised in an impromptu toast, I felt the adrenaline that had carried me through the confrontation beginning to ebb. The pain would come later in private, but for now, I had maintained my dignity and protected my future. My father would have been proud. The weeks following that fateful dinner were a storm of legal meetings, emotional conversations, and personal recalibration. The divorce proceedings began almost immediately. Richard tried desperately to invalidate the prenuptial agreement, hiring an aggressive attorney from New York, since the Boston legal community's top tier was unavailable to him. Their primary argument centered on the age of the document and claimed I had exerted undue influence as an attorney. The judge, a woman in her 60s with a reputation for fairness, was unimpressed by these arguments. The agreement was properly executed with both parties represented by independent counsel, she noted. Mr. Monroe was a graduate of Harvard Law School when he signed it. "Are you suggesting he didn't understand a straightforward infidelity clause?" After 3 months of legal maneuvering, Richard finally accepted that the prenup would stand. The final settlement awarded me control of 70% of our assets, including a 65% ownership stake in his firm. He retained enough to maintain a comfortable lifestyle, but not the empire he had envisioned building with Megan. The emotional aftermath was more complex than the legal battle. Some mornings, I would wake up and reach across the bed, momentarily, forgetting that 32 years of shared sleep had ended. The house felt too large, too quiet, without Richard's booming voice or the familiar sounds of his morning routine. There were days when grief overwhelmed me, not just for the marriage I had lost, but for the man Richard had once been, or who I thought he had been. Other days brought anger so intense, it felt like a physical presence squeezing my chest and clouding my vision. How dare he throw away our life together? How could he humiliate me so publicly? But through it all, I was not alone. My children rallied around me with unwavering support. Amanda temporarily moved back home, claiming she wanted to renovate her condo, but I knew she was worried about me being alone. Jason called daily, often stopping by with dinner and distracting me with stories about his latest business ventures. Sandra proved to be the rock I needed, available day or night for long talks, quiet companionship, or the occasional evening with too much wine and bitter laughter. "Men may come and go," she told me one night, "but female friendships are forever." My colleagues at Wilson & Partners were surprisingly supportive. When I decided to return to full partnership at the firm, the managing partner welcomed me warmly. "We've always kept your office ready," she said. "Your strategic mind has been missed." Immersing myself in complex corporate cases provided a welcome distraction and a reminder of my professional capabilities. I had always been good at my job. Now I threw myself into it with renewed passion. The focused concentration required for legal work gave my mind respite from personal turmoil. Through mutual friends, I learned that Megan's pregnancy progressed while her relationship with Richard deteriorated. She had targeted him, believing he was wealthier than he actually was, envisioning a life of luxury as the young wife of a successful businessman. The reality of his diminished circumstances after the divorce settlement left her bitter and resentful. By the time their daughter was born, they were barely speaking. Richard moved into a modest apartment near his now diminished company, where he continued to work under the watchful eye of the board of directors I had appointed. Megan eventually left Boston altogether, returning to her hometown in Ohio with the baby and a much smaller child support agreement than she had anticipated. 6 months after the divorce was finalized, Richard called and asked to meet for coffee. Against my better judgment, I agreed. He looked older, the confident swagger replaced by a subdued demeanor. He had lost weight, and his expensive wardrobe had been replaced by off-the-rack shirts that didn't quite fit. "I made the biggest mistake of my life," he said without preamble. "I threw away everything that mattered for a fantasy that fell apart as soon as it faced reality." "A second chance," he said, reaching for my hand across the table. "We had 32 good years. We could still have many more." I gently withdrew my hand from his reach. "No, Richard, we can't go back. What happened wasn't a momentary lapse of judgment. It was a series of deliberate choices over months. You brought your pregnant mistress to our anniversary dinner. There's no coming back from that level of disrespect." "I wasn't thinking clearly," he pleaded. "Megan was. She made me feel young again. And now you feel old and alone," I said, not unkindly. "I'm sorry for that, truly. But I deserve more than being someone's safe harbor after their midlife crisis shipwrecks." As I walked away from that coffee shop, I felt lighter somehow. The conversation had provided a kind of closure I hadn't realized I needed. Richard would always be the father of my children, a part of my history, but he would not be my future. That future began to take shape in unexpected ways. I established a legal aid clinic for women facing difficult divorces, using part of my settlement to fund free consultations for those who couldn't afford representation. It gave me profound satisfaction to help other women navigate the complexity of ending a marriage with their rights and dignity intact. I discovered a passion for gardening, transforming my backyard into a lush retreat filled with native plants in a small koi pond. The physical labor, impatient, nurturing, required provided both exercise and meditation. On summer evenings, I would sit beside the pond with a glass of wine, listening to the water and feeling a peace I hadn't expected to find again. New friendships blossomed as I joined a book club and a hiking group. Without the obligations of being Richard's wife in our former social circle, I found freedom to explore interests I had set aside years ago. I took cooking classes, learning cuisines from around the world, and traveled to places Richard had never been interested in visiting. 8 months after the divorce, I was appointed to the board of the Boston Legal Aid Society. At my first meeting, I met James Harrington, a widowed judge with kind eyes and a dry sense of humor. Our conversation flowed easily, touching on books, legal philosophy, and the challenges of growing children. When he asked if I might be interested in attending a chamber music concert with him, I surprised myself by accepting. I don't know if this new relationship will lead anywhere significant, but I'm open to possibilities in a way I couldn't have imagined during those dark days after Richard's betrayal. Life at 58 has turned out to be full of unexpected new chapters. The most important lesson I've learned through this journey is that preparation and self-respect are not just professional assets, but personal ones as well. My father's insistence on that prenuptial agreement was indeed the greatest gift he could have given me, not just for the financial protection it provided, but for the message it sent. Always value yourself enough to protect your future, even when you're in love. Love requires both trust and wisdom. Trust in the people you choose to share your life with, but wisdom to protect yourself if that trust is broken. This doesn't make you cynical. It makes you strong. For any woman watching who finds herself facing betrayal or the end of a relationship she thought would last forever, I want you to know this. You will survive, and you can thrive. Your story doesn't end with someone else's poor choices. It continues with your resilience and determination to write new chapters on your own terms. Have you ever had to reinvent yourself after a major life change? I'd love to hear your stories in the comments below. If you found value in my experience, please subscribe to my channel and share this video with someone who might need to hear that there is life. Beautiful, meaningful life after betrayal. Thank you for listening, and remember, the strongest women aren't those who never fall, but those who rise again with greater wisdom and purpose.